Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. We're back with Spike's editor, Tom Slater. Delighted also to welcome Spike columnist and stand-up comedian, Simon Evans.
Hello.
Tom, you've got a quick announcement before we kick off?
Yes, as we've been talking about on the pod for the last couple of weeks, do go and get your copy of After the Pogrom, Brendan O'Neill's brilliant new book on the 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization. We had some issues with the Amazon, some freak incidents and glitches. So if you've been struggling to get your copy, it's now all fixed, so please do go and get one. We're also still giving them away exclusively signed copies to anyone who donates £50 or more to Spiked while stocks last. So do go and get your copy, especially if you had trouble getting one in the last couple of days. It's now all sorted.
And I've been meaning to find out what happened on October the 7th. It's I've got a feeling it's going to be quite significant.
Never got round to getting to grips with that one.
Once you've bought your book, make sure you also get your tickets for the Battle of Ideas, because we'll be doing not one, but two Spiked podcasts. I'll be hosting this podcast, the Spike podcast, with brilliant special guests. We'll have Tom Slater, of course, but also Kathleen Stock, the philosopher, Graham Linehan of Father Ted fame, and Spike favourite Rakib Ihsan. And Tom, do you want to tell us a bit about Last Orders?
Yes, absolutely. So Last Orders, the Nanny State podcast that I do with Chris Snowden twice a month. We're also going to be at the Battle of Ideas on the Saturday. We're going to be joined by some fantastic guests. Most of all, Simon Evans, who is going to be there. Also, Julia Hartley-Brewer and Kate Andrews. So get your tickets you can get a ticket for the Saturday or the Sunday. Why not do the whole weekend? You can see both of our shows and many more brilliant panels. Also, there's an offer on, I believe.
Yeah,
Fraser
so
for
you
Spike
can get
reviewers.
20% off if you put Spiked 24 in at the checkout. So that's Spiked 24. You'll get 20% off. That's an amazing discount. Don't miss it. And Simon, tell us about your tour.
I am touring at the moment, folks. A show called Have We Met? And it's a 2-hour comedy Odyssey. It's very much based on literally on the Homeric epic of the Odyssey, although it wasn't supposed to be at first. I realised I'd nicked the format about halfway through and just decided to lean into it. So, it's online. You can find all the details if you look. The Simon Evans is the name of my website, and Have We Met is the tour, and all the tickets are up online through the autumn and into the spring. And also, as you say, Battle of Ideas.
Very exciting. And so loads to talk about today. We'll be talking about the Tory leadership contest, the deindustrialisation of Britain, the Israel-Iran conflict, if we can call I don't know if we can call it a war quite yet, and finally the vice presidential debate. First off, Tom, we had the Tory party conference this week. Quite interestingly, we had the sort of beauty parade of the final four candidates. What did you make of their performances?
Well, it's been an interesting one, partly because of how little it's managed to cut through. I mean, it's one of the things about this Tory leadership campaign, which because of the fact that not only are they in opposition, but also the fact that people expect them to be in opposition for quite a while, it was striking how in the day after all of the leadership candidates were trotted out to give their addresses to the delegates, that it didn't manage to make the news. Obviously, burgeoning war in the Middle East took care of the front pages that particular day. But it's when you look at it, I think it is quite interesting. First of all, because the candidate who was very much kind of standing out above the rest in recent weeks was definitely Kemi Badenoch. She's gone through a kind of week of a series of, to my mind, kind of basically confected controversies, it feels like. I mean, It began with her writing a piece in the Sunday Telegraph talking about how not all cultures are equally valid, as she put it, and being hauled over the coals for saying so. Various appearances at Tory party conference making offhand comments about maternity pay, and then later on having the gall to criticise civil servants, and that getting a lot of people upset. But I was reminded, as we saw those speeches yesterday, the day that we're recording, just how really, if the Tories are looking for someone who at least is going to cut through on those issues, she does seem to still be that candidate. But at the same time, that doesn't seem to be the mood within the Conservative Party, and certainly among MPs who seem to be in the process of crowning Robert Jenrick, who's the kind of born-again right-winger in this contest as the favourite at this point. So there's still a fair amount of time to go in this particular contest. But it has been striking just how much things have shifted, I suppose, over the course of this past week, even if not as many people have been paying attention as they might.
Yeah, I mean, Jenrick's transformation has been fascinating. I mean, he was pretty much a full-on Cameroon when he came into the Tory party. I mean, people who are on his side describe him as almost like parody-level centrist blandy. And now he's posing as, to the right of Suella Braverman, almost like a Farageist kind of candidate. Simon, is there anything you want to pick up on there, or any aspect of the Tory party?
I do find it fascinating and interesting. Just as a soap opera, I haven't been like a massive Jenrick watcher for many years, so he sort of gradually swam into my radar, I suppose, as it became obvious that the Tories were going to lose, in July.
As he started losing weight as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, possibly. I kind of think Kemi Badenoch, I think you're right, confected scandals, but also unforced errors to some extent. And for somebody who's normally so careful and articulate and has been so effective at the dispatch box and so on, I was a bit disappointed with her. She tried to make a couple of important points, for instance, about maternity leave and working mums and so on, and got lost in the weeds. And those are issues which need stating very clearly. And if the Tories are going to state policies and positions which are potentially controversial, even toxic, but which need saying, then you absolutely have to nail them down before you open your mouth. So that is a little bit of a worry. On the other hand, Jenrick, as you say, I can't help wondering whether he's almost caught the wind of the sort of Trump-Vance momentum and has decided to kind of go in on an American sort of style ticket. He seems to be throwing around some really quite hard right slogans and strong statements. Well, statements that wouldn't be out of place at all in the reform mouth on immigration and the boats and so on. So how that will play, I don't know. I still think he's pretty fascist. I still think he's unknown. I still doubt that more than 1 in 10 of the British public could identify him in a lineup. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kemi Badenoch is a lot more charismatic. She is armour-plated in important ways, as the Labour Party have once again, elected a member of the Porridge, a member of the Porridge left, as their leader. An incredibly dismal record they have for all of their, chat about diversity and inclusion, whereas she, is in a very strong position from that point of view. And is highly intelligent, and I think she should like regather and regain the top ground. But it is pretty clear that it's between those two, despite you saying it's down to the final four. I think we're down to the final two and have been for some time. Yeah,
we should talk a bit about the two offshoots. I mean, you've got James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat almost vying for the second place. Traditionally, in the past few Tory races, they've pit it between. There's been one wet and one dry sort of candidate, one Lib Dem curious, one Reform curious. One of them wants, they want to be the candidate of the people who would never vote Tory. Really.
Somebody said online a little while ago, talking about TV presenters on shows like, Strictly or The One Show, that whether consciously or not, there's usually a dog and a cat, which I thought was very interesting. And actually, it really does map onto all of them. They're not often the dog is the male and the cat is the female, but not always. Strictly is two females, but there's definitely a dog and a cat. I wonder whether they'll think about that. I mean, in the final two, I think you would probably say Kemi is a cat and Jenrick is a dog. But dogs have to have, in order to impress, dogs have to be sort of silent and have a basso profundo woof. They have to walk proud and upright, but speak slowly and carry a big stick. And there's a bit of a sort of sense with Jenrick that he's yapping and has got a small stick at the moment, which is not a good look.
Bit of an overgrown schoolboy vibe.
Yes,
he does. I saw Gareth Roberts wrote about the kind of also-rans, I suppose, in this race, but also talked about Jenrick, how he looks like he's going to his first day of big school carrying his briefcase and, his hair combed by a mother. He certainly does have that vibe.
What are you got in there, Jenrick? Yeah. Got your sandwiches.
It does feel like if we're talking about Badenoch and Jenrick, it does feel like one thing that distinguishes them is, I understand that in the cut and thrust of a leadership debate in which people are making unforced errors and mistakes, it's easy to forget this. But of all the people who are running, I think Badenoch has a good claim to actually having a very clear-cut record, and one that speaks to a big concern amongst the sort of Tory selectorate, but also amongst the electorate more broadly on these issues of culture. I think she was genuinely quite effective and courageous on pushing back against gender ideology, pushing back against critical race theory. It's worth remembering that when she comes in as the kind of equalities minister, many of her predecessors had basically towed the line on a lot of those issues where woke politics was concerned. And she took an awful lot of flack even for just meeting detransitioners like Keira Bell and for trying to push back against Stonewall's influence and whatever. Jenrick is very much trying to claim the immigration issue. But at the same time, I think there's a curious mix of, first of all, questions about how sincere it is. I mean, that's something which people can change their mind about issues, of course. But at the same time, the speed with which he went from a quite kind of middle of the road centrist to as you were saying, Simon, kind of being quite hardline about these issues is curious. I mean, he was
Yeah.
put in the Home Office as an immigration minister, hilariously so, to keep an eye on Suella Braverman, to basically be a kind of Sunakite in the department to try and make sure that she didn't, in the words of one unnamed Tory source, do anything too stupid. And yet, as you say, Fraser, he's kind of tried to position himself as almost to the right of her. I mean, the fact that a lot of Tory grandees in the parliamentary party of the right were moving behind his campaign was why Suella didn't throw a hat into the ring originally. So there's questions about that. I also think whilst obviously immigration, integration, the issues of Islamism and anti-Semitism and all these things that have been bursting out onto our streets over the course of the past year with the October the 7th anniversary approaching, these are all very important issues. I think there's the question of how sincere it is with Jenrick on some of these issues, but there's also, I think he might be stumbling into this notion that the public aren't just concerned about these issues, but they are actually the kind of Guardianista caricature, that he has engaged occasionally in a kind of performative, like mean-spiritedness, where some of these issues are concerned, like when he was still in post in the Home Office and infamously suggested that these murals of like Mickey Mouse and Baloo the Bear in asylum centres for children should be painted over because they were too welcoming. And you just think, of course, people recognise that the asylum system has become dysfunctional and a joke. Of course, people want immigration to be grappled with. But at the same time, I think there is a tendency of some people on the right of politics to buy into that sort of Guardianista caricature, which is that people aren't just concerned about immigration, but they're kind of they're more virulently anti-migrant than that,
there's too many orphan children coming over here and stuff. No one thinks like that.
No, I mean, the thing with those, funnily enough, a friend of mine who's a cartoonist actually got involved in a campaign to sort of protect them and to put up reassuring and friendly images and so on. So I did sort of notice that. And I think it's really important not to confuse things that make life bearable for refugee children, or even just children who have come over with economic migrants, who whatever, from things which act as bad incentives. You don't want to create an incentive for people to cross the channel illegally. You've got to minimise that as much as possible. Literally nobody is trying to get across the channel so that they can access a cheerfully decorated waiting room. It's absolutely absurd. So and I was interested to see Jesse Norman, who I have a lot of time for, ex Treasury Minister, who is still an MP, but not. I don't think. I think he's not a Tory MP. Doesn't have any particular ambitions, I don't think, anymore in government. But he was horrified by Jenrick's speech and said so on Twitter. Said it was disgusting and sort of cartoonish, as you say, and just seem to be regurgitating the worst kind of social media posts. And that's a bad person to lose, in my view. That's the kind of... But the big question, I mean, for me, immigration and trans and all those sort of issues are very inflammatory. But of course, the main reason that people vote Tory ultimately is to create a society in which business can flourish, inward investment comes in, and people can buy homes and raise their children in the confident expectation that they'll have a better life than they've had, and so on. That's the kind of forward trajectory that you need to be offering as a Tory. And you mustn't get too bogged down in the cultural war issues. And I don't hear very much from any of them on that stuff, really. I don't know who I do trust with it more, but in a way I'd like to say, who would you see as your ideal chancellor, once you're in, rather than addressing, yes, you need to have the courage of your convictions and demonstrate character to the degree that you know what a man and a woman is, That is an important issue, but it's equally important to be able to say, this is how I envisage Britain attracting investment where we still haven't completely sorted out what the opportunities and challenges presented by Brexit are and so on. This stuff is not quite so lurid and neon, but it really needs to be grappled with.
There's been a lot of fluff on it, I think, so hearing various candidates, James cleverly just talking about the importance of optimism. Well, I suppose that's better than Keir Starmer's dreariness, but it's not a strategy.
It's a bit Kamala, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Let's have some joy.
And it's interesting how economically as well, they do seem to have, broadly speaking, kind of jettisoned the sort of what you might call the Boris Johnson insight, which is that if you're going to hold on to that electorate they managed to carve out in 2019, economically the offer cannot just be, we're going to do Thatcherism again, but really mean it this time. And the levelling up as sort of insubstantial and as it was, and how derailed it was by the pandemic and so on, was a reflection of the fact that where the public are, they might be crudely speaking, more conservative on social issues, as is sometimes described. Well, often it's just more commonsensical on those issues.
Not barking mad.
No, exactly. But at the same time, do recognise that the economy, the kind of to again be crude about it, the kind of neoliberal fantasy island offered by a trust site or whatever is not necessarily where the electorate are at. But at the same time, I think the reason that cultural issues come up so much in this leadership election is they have intuited that this stuff does matter to voters. If nothing else, it's a kind of signal of recognising that we're on the side of the majority in recognising these concerns, in recognising material reality sometimes. And I was interested by the backlash to that Kemi Badenoch comment, which we've kind of moved on quite quickly from. But the way in which you had the media trying to basically kind of clutch their pearls in response to someone saying that maybe not all cultures are as good as others, I thought was really quite strange, because we've come to expect this. And I think the media are primed to respond to anything someone from the Conservative Party says about these hot button issues by screaming bigot and so on. But the fact that all she said was, I tend to think that a culture or a society in which, say, child marriage is allowed is, you should be want to stand in judgment of that, and to not want that in your own society was seen as so controversial. But I do wonder how much of this is just partisan, because I think if a politician from, say, the right of the Labour Party had made these comments, they might be applauded for their bravery in wading into tough issues. But at the same time, whenever it comes from a Conservative, you just see this response as if everyone is cultural relativists suddenly.
Can I make an observation there as well? I noticed a remark during the debate, might come onto it later, that J.D. Vance made about privileging the residents, long-term residents of Springfield, that whole controversy about the Haitians.
The dogs.
A bit privileging their life experience over those of the recently arrived. And again, the left were like absolutely appalled, as if to somehow privilege long-term residents, American citizens, over recent arrivals, however legally they may have come, were again, the rhetoric from the Nazi era. And it's a similar thing. It's not quite cultural relativism, but again, you can, I think, legitimately say not only are all cultures not equal, but also there is a default supposition that the one we have all grown up with should be defended and protected and allowed, the casting vote in any clash. And that again seems to me to be something that would have been not necessary even to enunciate 10 minutes ago, and now needs defending quite hard,
And then also, they're not really cultural relativists, because, when pushed, they will discuss, say, the culture amongst white working class Brits as steeped in national chauvinism and ugly racial attitudes, and they eat terrible things. They're from a superficial level to a more deeper level. They will stand in judgment of all kinds of cultures. I think often it's a sort of bigotry of low expectations masquerading as a who am I to judge that often comes into play. This idea that if you happen to see in certain parts of the world reactionary, misogynistic, homophobic cultures existing, that it doesn't do to talk about them, even though people in those parts of the world are suffering under those systems.
I'd say very quickly, there's always the suspicion as well, though I don't know sort of who it might come from, that during this conversation, what is really being attacked is the very idea of culture at all, that people have anything that they've inherited from their parents or from the books they've read, and that should be replaced by consumerism, essentially. You want people to behave as closely as possible to, irreducible but ultimately little consuming units, economic units. That's what worries me as well.
Yeah. This episode of the Spiked podcast is brought to you by AG1. With the summer over and the days getting colder and darker, it can often feel difficult to feel like your best self. It's no surprise that many of us drop our healthier habits this time of year. The good news, though, is that looking after yourself doesn't have to be a struggle. I found this out myself when I started drinking AG1. AG1 is a daily nutrition supplement that helps you stay on top of your health. Just one scoop contains 70 high-quality ingredients, all designed to meet your basic nutritional needs. I usually drink AG1 with my breakfast. All I do is mix one scoop with water, and in less than a minute, I'm all sorted. AG1's simple ingredients can have a huge impact on your day-to-day life. Pantothenic acid can help you stay sharp. Folate can help keep tiredness away, and copper can help release nutrients in the food you eat. AG1's blend of vitamin C and zinc can even help strengthen your immune health. A few of us at Spikes have been struck down by the latest cold this week, but my morning scoop has helped me just about keep it off. Don't take my word for it as well. AG1 is trusted by Olympians, F1 drivers, and footballers, So why not give it a go yourself? If you want to replace your multivitamins and more, start with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription. Just go to drinkag1.com/spiked. That's drinkag1.com/spiked. Check it out. So, a huge, quite tragic milestone was passed this week, or celebration for some people. The last coal-powered power station was turned off. It produced its last bit of electricity in the UK on midnight Tuesday night, bringing to an end 142 years of electricity generation from coal. I mean, there's been some similar stories as well. There was also the same day, the Port Talbot Steelworks closed its last remaining blast furnace, its coal-powered blast furnace. Recently, we also learned that Grangemouth, Scotland's last oil refinery, was to shut down. A refinery that represents or makes 80% of Scotland's fuel, 4% of its GDP.
Mm-hmm.
Tom, this is the green revolution, so-called, but it doesn't seem like something to be excited about or something particularly progressive.
No, I mean, what we're seeing is essentially the green deindustrialisation of the United Kingdom, and yet it's being presented as a positive. I mean, reading the BBC write-up of the closure of the Nottinghamshire coal-fired power station, they were hailing it as a great victory, that because so much progress had been made on renewables, that therefore they were able to close it a year early. Forget the jobs that are going to be lost as a consequence. Isn't this wonderful? And yet what's entirely skated over is the fact that not only is this an issue for jobs in certain areas which are reliant on those jobs and so forth, but also the fact that in tandem with this burst towards renewables, we have witnessed the skyrocketing of energy prices, the fact that we're now in the UK, in terms of industrial energy prices, paying more than any other country in the developed world. And we're also deindustrializing faster than almost any other country in the developed world. And those two things are obviously related. There's a refusal to really grasp what's going on here. And also, I think, rejection of the sort of inheritance of the Industrial Revolution, without being too grand about it. I mean, if you think about coal, and if you think about the blast furnace, these are fundamental to the great gift that this country gave the world, if we're going to be slightly jingoistic for a moment, in terms of what was unleashed there. And the fact that this is kind of being presented as a positive, I find very strange, because it's not to say that you're going to fetishize any one particular mode of industrial production or one particular mode of energy generation. But what's obvious to anyone who's been paying attention is that what is being presented to us as wonderful green alternatives are essentially not even a fraction of the sort of potential that was gained through fossil fuels. It's not to say that we shouldn't embrace, nuclear power or other forms of energy, but the way in which effectively a kind of deindustrialization and a form of national decline is being presented as a positive, I find very dispiriting.
Yeah. And
the fact that no one really is willing to admit that that's what's going on here, I suppose.
And it's worth pointing out that coal is still by far, the cheapest form of energy. That's why India and China are building coal plants aplenty, and good for them. The only reason it seemed expensive in the UK was because of various carbon taxes and net zero policies. So it was made deliberately unviable. And then you have, various screens saying, aha, look, it's not even, it's polluting and it's not even cheap. It doesn't do the job you want it to. But, we know that this plant in Nottinghamshire was absolutely integral to keeping the lights on during the recent energy crisis. I mean, it was only on for a few hours at a time, but avoiding blackouts is pretty important job, and that's something that actually is going to be, we're putting ourselves at risk at. It's not just that we're deindustrializing, that these heavy industries are closing down. Even the most basic functions of powering people's homes is now at risk thanks to the green agenda, which is deeply, deeply worrying. Simon, what have you made of it? I mean, there's also a social history of coal, I guess, is the other,
Listen, I don't particularly care about the social history or the Industrial Revolution as an historical legacy that we should be proud of. We should absolutely prioritise the future, but it's extraordinarily worrying, the figures, as you say, that are emerging. And it's not only Britain, of course. Most of Europe is deindustrialising. Germany is at least as bad. And, for most of my adult life, of course, we regarded Germany as a competitor, but now it's becoming more and more obvious, whether or not we're in the EU or not, that China and the East and then America are our competitors, and we should all be trying to maintain some sort of, balance in Europe's ability to manufacture. Matt Ridley has been posting quite a few graphs and statistics lately, none of which I've memorized, of course, but demonstrating that the wattage, the kilobytes or whatever of power, of electrical power that are used per person in America now, an order of magnitude more than in Britain. It's terrifying. We're turning into a developing nation. It's really scary how brazen, how utterly cavalier they are being with the industrial future of the country, as if we can all just move into service tech or I don't know what even things like biotech, which are maybe not like filthy power station sort of aesthetically, still require a certain amount of energy to keep the lights on. And we've become, I think, somehow hypnotized by an aesthetic rather than an actual plan. People think electric vehicles are cleaner and quieter, and they can be lovely. I've driven in a few. It's very nice to purr around, but the reality is the open cast mining is taking place out of the corner of your eye. It's still the planet. If it's the planet you're trying to save, the best policy for Britain, as Konstantin Kisin put it beautifully in his speech to the Oxford Union, the best policy for Britain would be to absolutely be world leaders that would suck in all the best available talent around the world that would come here and work on creating the new green technology that will eventually save us, but not to switch to it before we're ready.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and even people who are advocates of net zero or whatever, the International Energy Agency have said, the technology is not there. Our own Climate Change Commission says that 60% or more of greenhouse gas cuts will have to come from what they quite euphemistically call behavior change. That means traveling less, doing less, consuming less,
literally dimming the lights.
And that's where everything gets turned on its head, because of course the great inheritance, the great boon of the Industrial Revolution is not the coal or the smog or anything like that per se. It's the tremendous economic growth that was unleashed by this. It's the way in which living standards shot up, the way in which is a kind of knock-on effect of that, literacy, all these great things which took place as a consequence of human ingenuity and human hard work. It's all of those lessons have kind of been forgotten. Like the idea of energy being, as people used to say, too cheap to meter as a sort of goal has been completely gone now, because that would be seen as reckless. You almost make a virtue out of energy being expensive, because therefore you'll use less of it and so on. All of that is being lost now, in a really
if we start with
way.
Nuclear, that could have been a conceivable. I mean, that is almost what they have in France, or have had, electricity incredibly cheap. And as my father never tired of pointing out, if you're worried about nuclear disasters, A, we get our energy from France, and B, there are closer nuclear reactors to London than Sizewell B or whatever it's, Windscale or whatever it was called. So, it's an absurd idea of the fear of it. But that, I guess, is gone now. I don't know. I was reading on the BBC's website about the history of the coal-fired power stations. And I don't know if it was the first one, but there was one that was in Holborn Viaduct. Opened by Thomas Edison.
That was
the very first one,
right in the heart of the centre of London. This is, as you say, I'm not saying I don't care about the history. I'm fascinated by it, but it's if it were obsolete, fine, get rid of it. If it were on balance, even obviously a bad thing, but they just haven't made the case. They've lost the case. They've lost the argument, and they've gone, well, we're going to do it anyway. So suck it up.
Yeah. Let's talk about the unfolding conflict in the Middle East. I mean, we have things might have changed quite radically by the time people are watching this, but at the time we're expecting Israel to retaliate to a strike from Iran, which was hitting Tel Aviv. Extraordinary in response, as expected, to the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, the former head of Hezbollah. Israel has quite incredibly wiped out a huge chunk of Hezbollah's leaders, but still it feels like Iran had to make some kind of retaliation to not lose face, I guess, is the...
I suppose it's because so much has happened in such a short space of time, it's easy to not take all of it in. I mean, I think by the time we recorded last week's podcast, Nasrallah hadn't even been assassinated yet. That in and of itself is such a tremendous moment, not only in Israel's attempt to neutralize Hezbollah so that they can return those 60,000 Israelis back to northern Israel, because since October the 8th, Hezbollah have been shelling that part of the country in solidarity with the pogromists of Hamas, but also the centrality of Hezbollah to the so-called axis of resistance propped up and funded and backed by Iran. I mean, Hezbollah was always essentially kind of Iran's insurance policy against any conflict with Israel. The idea that if anything happened, that therefore they would come under fire from that border to their north. Now, not just with Nasrallah, but also the pagers and the walkie-talkies and the precision strikes on various Hezbollah leaders. They've lost basically almost entirely their first tier and second tier command structure in an incredibly short space of time. And they're very significant, not just to Iran, but to the kind of broader axis, so-called. They were involved in training various other proxies. And so we're at a really significant moment. I mean, I think the other thing that's worth stressing is that the Iran attack on Israel was a significant step up to what happened back in April when they fired rockets at them for the first time. Back in April, it was something which was very clearly telegraphed that they were going to do this. They also fired a mixture of kind of ballistic missiles, but also drones and things that were a lot easier to pick out of the sky. This time it was all ballistic missiles, things that very little warning was also telegraphed that this was going to happen. And there was a much greater intent to actually inflict damage on Israel this time around. But also it's been an expression, I think, of Iran's weakness in many respects. The fact that it has had its key militia in the form of Hezbollah being decapitated essentially overnight. And also because of the fact that domestically it's so weakened, not only by external sanctions, but also by an increasingly restive population. They did feel the need for issues of pride and so on, that they needed to retaliate. But at the same time, they appear a very weakened power than they were even a week ago at this point.
Simon.
Yes, again, agree with all of that. It's very interesting. I'm not a foreign affairs expert. Perhaps I don't know whether I'm what insights you want me to offer, but I feel sometimes more capable of observing resonances. And it reminded me much less of a war film than of the final scenes of The Godfather. I wanted to see it intercut with Netanyahu attending the christening, or not christening, the bar mitzvah of, the wiping out of all these senior figures. And as you say, you take out the top tier, and that's one thing. But the people were being sort of promoted, as it were, and assassinated within days. And at some point, yes, it is organised crime, essentially, Hezbollah, rather than anything more like a traditional military or political unit. And if you destroy that much, there's no kind of culture. There's no kind of, right, read the manual quickly, we need you to take over. It's going to be absolutely crippling. I don't know whether they can come back from it. I'm also interested in what you say about Iran. I think, as you say, restive is a good word for their population. It's clearly an extraordinarily unpopular regime, even within Iran. It's interesting the way that Islamist Gazans and so on and Hamas refer to the Zionist entity. They hate to even say the word Israel. They like to pretend it's almost makes it sound like an alien or something, the Zionist entity. But I think that word is sort of more appropriate to the Islamic Republic of Iran, a power that has control within the country, but is it's so deeply unpopular. It's interesting that it's even more than obviously it's an endless conversation that people go, you do realize Hamas, would kill you, you're gay, or they would force you to do this or that. But there's a lot of left-wing people in this country and around the world and in the West who have had enough of Iran's regime now. So they've lost that as well. So it's unpicking these threads and finding out where they go back to is the key. And I've begun to think that Israel's intelligence and planning, and that they are several moves ahead. I have that strong sense now. God knows from how far back or who knew what or was thinking this is the time when we need to act, because clearly there are demographic changes taking place in the West and in America in particular. If they lose America, then Israel will struggle to survive, so they have to reshape their part of the world as quickly as possible while they still have sufficiently strong support, I think, within Washington to do so. And they may be thinking of doing something really quite decisive. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I don't know, but obviously they are quite familiar with the idea of taking decisive action that many of us would rather sort of step back from.
And it's been striking how there's been this sort of the commentary in the West is very much as if any sort of reaction from Israel was going to be illegitimate or warmongering. There's been, aside from understandable concerns about the extent to which this conflict could broaden, widen, suck different powers in.
Spiral out of control.
There's that's obviously understandable, but there's almost, because there is this sort of ambient anti-Israel sentiment, the idea that responding in any way would be, first of all, understandable, but also obviously preferable from the perspective of Israel, was instantly kind of cast into doubt. Like there is this kind of idea that the best thing they could possibly do is just hunker down and hope that the Iron Dome sorts them out. Like no appreciation whatsoever that you've got a nation which is surrounded by these proxy forces propped up by Iran, who are united primarily by their loathing of the Jewish state and Jews fundamentally. That they've had to deal with constant rocket fire from their near abroad, and that there is a power who has been orchestrating and pushing this for some time, who then in recent days have fired so many missiles at them to the point where this is something which is a really significant moment for this nation and its defense of itself. The idea that it's almost outrageous or wrong-headed or reckless that they would want to deal with that threat in one way, shape or form, I found is always quite striking. But it has obviously been the nature of our discussion here in Britain and certainly in the US as well of Israel, which is to say that it's always the one that is overreacting. It's always the one that is overstepping the mark, despite the fact that it's coming under this supreme force and power.
Even the decapitation of Hezbollah leaders and targeted attacks like the pager attack are described as by some Westerners as being almost anti-civilian moves. There's nothing, no amount of targeting, no amount of precision, no amount of clarity on Israel's part can dislodge this idea that it's just this maniac genocidal state, which is
I think part of that, to be fair, maybe to be devil's advocate even, but I think part of that is the sense that we all feel, or many people in the West feel, they have a responsibility for Israel. Obviously Israel to some extent is the West cipher in that part of the world. We arm Israel. America has supported Israel for its entire existence, and it is perceived as being a sort of proxy in that regard. If there were, I suppose it's that sense that the left have in particular, that that they feel it's being done in their name, whereas nothing is being done by Hamas in anyone's name in this country. Nothing is being done by Hezbollah, but it's not an entirely it's not an entirely distant, arbitrary quarrel. We feel we have skin in this game whether we want to or not.
That's one of the interesting hypocrisies. I think you've got a kind of nominally anti-imperialist left who, if you're looking at what they're saying recently, think it is now basically the job of the American empire to tell this uppity little country not to defend itself.
So we had the vice presidential debate this week between Tim Walz and JD Vance. One of the stories that came out of this was Tim Walz essentially, he's a bit of a Walter Mitty character. I mean, he's told a lot of fibs, but one of them that really came to prominence during the debate was his claim to have been present during the Tiananmen Square uprising. Tom, what did you make of that?
Well, it wouldn't be as damaging if it wasn't for the fact that he's got a very strong track record now of making stuff up, seemingly to insert himself into whatever political debate is of the day. So as you say, he claimed previously that he was in Hong Kong whilst the Tiananmen Square protests were kicking off in Beijing, and therefore he had some sort of insider experience therefore that could be gleaned. It was later pointed out that he actually showed up, I believe after the protests were actually crushed and put down. There's been a long line of this now. The IVF was a big talking point in this election campaign because of the fact that a lot of very Catholic Republicans, JD Vance to the fore, were calling for that to be cracked down upon because of the fact that, embryos are discarded as part of that process. There's some very religious people are very concerned about that. Tim Walz came out very strongly and said that we had children via IVF. If JD Vance was in power, then we wouldn't have had a family. It turns out they used a different procedure, which doesn't involve casting aside the embryos and therefore wouldn't have been.
Born via.
Indeed, which is the subject of your show, which
yes, that's right.
Get into. There was also a kind of string of things about his service in the National Guard. He heavily implied during the kind of the ongoing debate about kind of school shootings and AR-15s and so on that these were weapons of war and ones that he had carried in war, even though he never actually saw combat. It's a recurring theme of his, is that he seems desperately to want to kind of center himself in all of these discussions. And I think it's a reminder, I guess, of sort of democratic hubris. As soon as he kind of popped up, there was this sense of, well, what a wonderful pick he was. Isn't he great? He's the school football coach. He's so relatable, and it's turned out to be a lot of, first of all, not just a Walter Mitty character, but a much weirder, to use his favourite phrase, character than they would previously like to suggest, I suppose.
That did seem to be the main thing going for him, as far as like the Team Harris was concerned, was that he used this word weird to describe JD Vance and Trump and other MAGA Republicans. I think my favourite Tim Walz story, which was put about by his campaign team rather than himself, but I think it was when he was running for Congress. He was actually he was arrested for drunk driving, but he tried to blame this on his military career. So he said, "No, I wasn't stopped for drunk driving. I was actually the officer didn't hear me because I was deaf, because I'd been, hearing all these,
Prince Andrew and
yeah, exactly.
I was
on my way back from the Pizza Express.
Yeah. So he did, he had hearing trouble because of all the weapons going off that he'd heard. He also gave him balance issues. He made up this story about how the judge even reprimanded the police officer for being so curt with him. It actually turns out, no, he was just over the drink driving limit, and he was driving, over 90 miles per hour in a 50 mile per hour zone. And, how on earth do you think you could get away with pretending that this is actually, something to do with your military record? Simon, what have you made of the...
But that's interesting. I hadn't heard that story. And in a way, I kind of prefer him. I like him slightly more for having done 90 and a 50. Because what he really has this very strong designated driver energy, and like the dad who doesn't lose his temper waiting for his daughter to come out of the disco, and he's just there, and it's a bit dull. It's like these people, they may be the backbone or at least a bone of society, but I find him very unexciting. It's interesting, though, they have to be careful, don't they, not to use all their ammo up, because that weird thing was interesting for a week, maybe 10 days, but it's gone now. That's evaporated. They threw that as hard as they could at Vance. And when a lot of us encountered him for the first time, he has a slightly weird look. I will say that. There is something slightly odd about him. But when you watch him a few times, you forget about that, start to listen to him. He's very articulate. He has a very clear understanding of lots of issues. I suspect he is highly intelligent, easily the most intelligent of the four. Has done quite a lot of reading, I suspect, again, possibly in some books that people would keep the spine towards the wall, possibly. But
don't show that on your Zoom call.
But I think he's a very bright man, and I don't think that Waltz is a very bright man. I think he's probably quite a decent man. I'm not. To be honest, what was it? It's over 35 years ago, Tiananmen Square. I mean, I'm about the same age as Waltz. I could imagine misremembering things like that. And I do remember Ronald Reagan claiming to have been on the Normandy beaches, and it turned out it was during a film shoot or something. People do this. It's not a partisan thing. It's a bit embarrassing. I doubt very much. You're right. He did do a similar thing. So maybe it is stolen valor, but I suspect it is actually just a wavering memory. I just don't find his character very convincing or strong, Obviously, the other thing that came out of the debate was him able to say, who won the last election? Do you think Trump is right in claiming that it was stolen? And Vance is he's in a tight corner in terms of that, and he wriggled out of it. But it's undignified to have to watch him, evade that question. In all other regards, I think he's been a very strong pick, a very strong pick. In fact, the one thing they usually say, I mean, there's funny memes going around about you always pick a VP who's like not as bright as you. So Obama picked Biden, Biden picked Harris. Who can Kamala Harris pick from there? There isn't literally stuffed, So, but Trump, to his credit, has picked a man who is, I think, brighter than he was. Certainly is more politically astute. Maybe not as strong in negotiation or whatever. Trump has some hidden strengths and has adopted such an extraordinarily arch persona, throughout his political career, that it's almost impossible to know who's underneath or behind it at all. But I find Vance quite plausible, I have to say, quite strong.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.